Edward enjoyed a tranquil Saturday afternoon in his garage, tidying up tools and stowing away his equipment before winter arrived. It was a day in Edward's life, tending to his garden just as any dedicated homeowner would. The sun sets in a golden hue, bathing his driveway in a warm, golden glow. With a contented sigh, he pressed the button toward him with determined purpose. Her eyes, though he couldn't ignore the tension hanging in the air. Him. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the line. Edward shook his head and exhaled real conflict with neighbors. Yet now he found it. But Karen's 911 call had set things in approached, yet he stood his ground, keeping his pot. A little neighborly curiosity was nothing new. But then Karen stepped off her porch and strode toward him with determined purpose, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Before Edward could even greet her, she launched into an accusation. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and laced with disdain and disbelief. Edward, used to keeping his cool, looked up with a neutral expression. "I'm just closing my garage, Karen. I live here, remember?" he replied calmly, his tone free of hostility, though he couldn't ignore the tension hanging in the air. Karen's eyes flashed with skepticism, and her mouth tightened. "I know who lives here. You're up to something. I've seen folks like you around this neighborhood before, and I'm not going to let it slide." Before Edward could respond, her hand was already reaching for her phone. Without another word, she began dialing 911, her gaze never leaving him. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the line. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's a suspicious man in my neighborhood, right outside my house," Karen said urgently. "He's acting odd, lurking around, and I have no idea what he's doing here. You need to send someone." Though the dispatcher hesitated, perhaps sensing something off in Karen's tone, they confirmed that officers would be dispatched to investigate. Edward shook his head and exhaled deeply. He had encountered his share of awkward moments in the neighborhood, but this felt different. There was something unsettling about Karen's hasty decision to involve the police. He couldn't understand why she was so bent on making a scene. As the call ended, Edward stood in his driveway waiting for the authorities, troubled by the sense of being unfairly targeted. He had lived in his home for years, without any real conflict with neighbors. Yet now he found himself accused without cause. His grip on the garage remote tightened as he glanced toward Karen, who had already stormed back into her house, leaving him with a lingering unease. What was behind her outburst? As the first police car rounded the corner, the gravity of the situation settled in. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was merely closing his garage, a routine act for any homeowner, but Karen's 911 call had set things in motion, and now he had to face the consequences. He hoped the officers would see the truth, though in that moment he realized that people like Karen rarely cared about the truth. They were more interested in control. The squad car pulled up with the familiar whir of tires on pavement. An officer stepped out, scanning the street, before his gaze settled on Edward. His heartbeat quickened slightly as they approached, yet he stood his ground, keeping his posture straight and his hands visible. He wasn't doing anything wrong, he just needed the officers to understand that. As the sun set, painting the sky in golden tones, a tall officer with a stern expression moved forward first, his eyes briefly taking in Edward before shifting to the garage. In a professional tone he asked, "Is everything okay here? We received a call about suspicious activity." Edward felt his chest tighten, her gaze drifting toward Karen's house with a refining into understanding nods. The female, "You might want to have a word with your neighbor this, unless there's a genuine," as the tension that had gripped his chest began. In the quiet aftermath, his search yielded little more than local news stories about over police records, court filings, and online dated with her name. As Edward down an even darker path. According to that, she had been involved in organizing and participating or proof of ownership, the first officer inquired. his tone neutral yet probing. Edward nodded and reached into his pocket, retrieving his driver's license and property documents. He handed them over without hesitation, confident they would clear up the misunderstanding. The officers examined the documents, their initial skepticism softening into understanding nods. The female officer stepped closer, radioing for additional verification of Edward's property ownership. Moments later, confirmation came through, and the officers exchanged an awkward glance. It was now evident that Edward had been in the right. "Everything checks out," the male officer said, his voice softer, yet his gaze still fixed on Karen's house. "However, you might want to have a word with your neighbor here." Karen, who had been watching from the doorway at a distance, stepped forward with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her face flushed with frustration. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the officer interrupted her. "Ma'am, we've confirmed that this is Mr. Edward's property, and there's nothing suspicious going on. We'd appreciate it if you refrained from making calls like this, unless there's a genuine emergency." Her lips pressed into a tight line in exasperation, but she remained silent as the officers turned to leave. The male officer offered Edward a sympathetic look, quickly adding, "Have a good day, sir," before both officers climbed back into their car and drove away. As the squad car disappeared around the corner, Edward stood still, taking deep breaths as the tension that had gripped his chest began to ease. He had been wrongfully accused, yet the truth had prevailed. Still, the whole encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth. Glancing back at Karen's house, he couldn't help but wonder what had driven her to make such a call. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last time she tried to stir up trouble for him. In the quiet aftermath, Edward walked back toward his house, the weight of the experience heavy in the air. Later that evening, he sat at his kitchen table scrolling through public records and online archives. Edward couldn't shake the impression that Karen's odd behavior and relentless attempts to cause mischief weren't merely quirks of personality. There was something deeper at work, and he was determined to find out what. Initially, his search yielded little more than local news stories about minor neighborhood disputes. However, as he dug deeper into older reports, a pattern began to emerge. He discovered references to a string of petty thefts linked to a woman named Karen Woodson. Seeing her full name didn't seem significant at first, but Edward couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that it was just the tip of the iceberg. So he pressed on. For hours, he pored over police records, court filings, and online forums, piecing together a history of Karen's past that sent chills down his spine. What he uncovered shocked him to his core. Karen wasn't merely a disgruntled neighbor. She had a long, troubling record of criminal behavior. Her petty thefts had escalated over the years into serious charges. Assault, fraud, and even links to organized crime were associated with her name. As Edward read through the police reports, his eyes widened. Although Karen had been arrested multiple times for violent offenses and had spent time in jail, much of her record had mysteriously been expunged. There were murmurs of backroom deals, hints of corruption, and the unsettling realization that she had likely never been held fully accountable for her past. A tip from another neighbor had led Edward down an even darker path. According to that tip, Karen had once been associated with a notorious gang involved in a series of high-profile crimes in the area. This gang was linked to smuggling, fraud, and violent intimidation tactics, and apparently Karen had served as one of their enforcers, doing the dirty work while staying in the shadows. Yet what struck Edward most profoundly was uncovering her ties to hate groups. She had been involved in organizing and participating in rallies where racist slogans and violence were commonplace. One particular event, which resulted in several arrests and garnered widespread media attention, stood out in her troubled history. Karen had been there earlier, leading chant. It was a calculated personal assault. Edward recognized an opportunity. He held the power. Sure enough, as he moved the cans toward her, voice shrill and trembling with feigned. It appeared that this very animosity had driven her to single him out. In her eyes, he wasn't merely an unfortunate individual, but a symbol of everything she despised. Her harassment wasn't random at all. It was a calculated personal assault fueled by years of pent-up racism and bitterness. As Edward sat back in his chair, he felt a surge of both anger and sorrow. With Karen's past now exposed, he fully understood the gravity of her actions. The woman he had once dismissed as a merely troublesome neighbor revealed herself to be far more dangerous. Yet amidst the turmoil, Edward recognized an opportunity. He held the power to break this toxic cycle before it escalated any further, determined to ensure that Karen could no longer prey on him or anyone else in the neighborhood. The very next day, Edward found himself in his driveway, bringing in the trash cans for the weekly pickup. The sun shone brightly, and the crisp autumn air promised another quiet day in the neighborhood, but Edward couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was lurking nearby. Sure enough, as he moved the cans toward his garage, he saw her emerge from her front door, stepping onto the porch with that same steely look of suspicion etched on her face. This time Karen wasted no time. She stormed across the yard toward him, fists clenched at her sides. As soon as she was within earshot, she began shouting, accusing him of watching her. "You've been watching me," Karen yelled, her voice shrill and trembling with feigned outrage. "You got too close to my property yesterday, and now I feel unsafe. You better stay off my lawn, or I'll make sure the police hear about this." Edward blinked in disbelief. He had barely even glanced her way, let alone come close to her property. His confusion quickly turned to frustration as Karen continued to accuse him of harassment. "Karen, I'm just putting the trash cans away," he explained calmly, despite the barrage of wild accusations. "You're overreacting again," she retorted, her face twisting with anger as she pulled out her phone and dialed 911 without hesitation. "911? What's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "There's a black man harassing me," Karen shouted into the phone. "He came too close to my property and I feel threatened. He's been doing this every day. He's dangerous. You need..." Clearly familiar with Karen's history, cautioned. This time he knew he had to be ready. All the facts, and now it was tested valuable police resources. He knew that this was his moment to stand up. Edward, who stood there in disbelief, eyes wide as he tried to remain calm. The sheer audacity of her words only fueled his frustration. The dispatcher, clearly familiar with Karen's history, cautioned, "Ma'am, we've received multiple calls about this same individual, and we'll send officers to check things out, but please ensure your claims are accurate." Despite this, Karen's grip on her phone tightened as she waited for the officers to arrive. Now, fully aware that this was yet another baseless attack, Edward steeled himself for what was to come. He could already hear the distant sound of sirens, and this time he knew he had to be ready. Armed with the fresh knowledge of Karen's criminal past, Edward was determined not to let her get away with another baseless report. He had resolved to set the record straight once and for all. As the sirens grew louder and the officer's car pulled up in front of his home, he could feel that familiar knot of frustration tightening in his chest. But this time, he wouldn't allow Karen's unfounded accusations to go unchallenged. He had gathered all the facts, and now it was time to expose the truth. Standing firm as the officer approached, Edward spoke in a calm yet resolute tone. "Officer, this is the second time in as many days that Karen has called the police on me for no reason," he began, his words measured and clear. He recounted the first incident at his garage, explaining how Karen had misinterpreted his actions and fabricated a story that wasted valuable police resources. The seasoned officer nodded in acknowledgement, though Edward sensed a hint of uncertainty in his expression, as if he wondered whether Karen was merely an overzealous neighbor. But Edward wasn't about to let the matter rest, especially now that he knew more about her troubling past. As the sky remained golden, the sun setting behind the trees, Edward felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that this was his moment to stand up, not just for himself, but for the entire community. The golden light bathed the scene in a serene glow, a stark contrast to the tension that had built up. Edward was ready to face whatever came next, determined to bring peace back to his Saturday afternoons. "I've done some research, officer," Edward continued. This case was different. Officer pieced everything together. It was now Karen's carefully maintained facade was about have record showing your involvement in criminal activity. This wasn't mere harassment. "I'm arresting you on charge," her into the back of the patrol car, the true extent of Karen's. But now her facade had cruelly exposed Karen's truth, allowed him to finally breathe easy. The officer wasn't naive. He could see the weight of Edward's words and the sincerity in his eyes. This wasn't just a case of simple neighborhood friction, it ran much deeper. Edward then mentioned a tip from a neighbor who had known Karen in the past and had first-hand knowledge of her involvement in gang activity. The officer took note. After a moment of reflective silence, the officer pieced everything together. It was now clear that Karen was not merely a neighbor with a grudge. She was a woman with a history of using fear and intimidation to manipulate others, and Edward had unwittingly become her next target. When the officer turned to confront Karen, Edward felt a slight sense of satisfaction. He had done his part. The truth was now in the open. Karen's carefully maintained facade was about to crumble. Seeing the officer approaching, she immediately shifted into a defensive stance and began to rant, vehemently denying everything Edward had just revealed. "This is absurd," she shouted, her face flushing red with anger. "He's making all of this up. I've never done anything wrong." Although her voice wavered, the officer remained calm and replied steadily, "Ma'am, we have record showing your involvement in criminal activity. These issues must be addressed." Karen's response was to double down on her false accusations, labeling Edward a liar. As her frustration grew, she unleashed a torrent of racial slurs at him, each word dripping with venomous hatred. Standing just a few feet away, the officer overheard every word. His expression darkened as he grasped the full extent of the situation. This wasn't mere harassment. It was racially motivated. With her hateful outburst, Karen had sealed her fate, providing the evidence the officer needed. Turning to Edward, the officer offered a nod of solidarity. It was time to put an end to this. With the tension hanging thick in the air, and fully aware of Karen's past and her unwarranted hostility toward Edward, he placed her under arrest. "Ma'am, I'm arresting you on charges of filing false police reports, harassment, and hate speech," the officer declared, his voice firm and resolute. This was the end of Karen's reign of terror. Karen's face contorted in disbelief. "You can't do this! I haven't done anything wrong!" she screamed, struggling as the officer secured her in handcuffs. "You're making a mistake!" she continued, but the officer remained unmoved. As he escorted her into the back of the patrol car, the true extent of Karen's criminal activities began to unfold. Investigators would later uncover additional evidence linking her to a series of fraud schemes, violent incidents, and a long history of racial discrimination. What Edward had uncovered was only the tip of the iceberg. For years, Karen had exploited her position in the neighborhood to intimidate others, confident that her reputation as a well-respected resident would shield her from suspicion. But now her facade had crumbled, and the truth stood exposed. News of her arrest spread rapidly throughout the community, and the reaction was swift. Neighbors who had once feared her or silently tolerated her outbursts began to speak out. Many admitted they had noticed her behavior before but had been too afraid or hesitant to act. Now they rallied behind Edward, showing their support for the brave man who had finally exposed Karen's true nature. As the officers drove Karen away, Edward stood on his porch watching the patrol car disappear down the street. He had stood up for himself, for his rights, and for the truth. He had battled the toxic forces of racism and hate, and he had emerged victorious. The golden sunset lingered in the sky, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. The palpable relief allowed him to finally breathe easy. The golden sunset marked the end of a long and eventful, but it was worth it. With Karen, aware of Karen's criminal past and despicable actions, gradually turned its back on her. No longer would they ignore her behavior. Justice had been served, not just for Edward, but for everyone who had ever been intimidated or silenced by her toxic presence. Looking out over his peaceful neighborhood, Edward felt a deep sense of vindication. The battle had been long, but it was worth it. With Karen now ousted from the community, he knew he could continue living his life free from fear of harassment or retaliation. He had made a difference, and the ripples of his courage would resonate for years to come.